Guys, this is going to be a quick video on how to end your short story well. This is something that a lot of students really struggle with because they get so wrapped up in actually writing their story that they feel like they run out of time to end well. And it's really, really important to make sure that you make time to wrap up your story. Otherwise, it just is going to leave your reader hanging, and you're not going to get a satisfying feeling even as an author because you haven't brought things to any kind of a satisfying conclusion. So here are 4 things that I really want you to know about great endings. Number 1, effective endings show or suggest the result of the story's conflict. This doesn't have to mean that everything needs to be wrapped up and beautiful and everybody doesn't have to be happy at the end of the story. However, it should show a potential end to the conflict, or it can show a twist that is kind of the start of an additional conflict, and that would be fine too. But again, it really should tie up what's happening with the main conflict in your story. That also includes both the external and the internal conflict. And so if you've got this external conflict happening, which is really the primary storyline, that's fine, but you also need to be addressing something about what that character is learning as they go through that conflict, and that comes down to what they are feeling inside. Number 2, effective story endings come from the main character's actions. It really doesn't work to end with anybody but that main character, but your protagonist. And so as you're going through and you're thinking about those things, you really want to figure out, okay, all the way through my story, I should have been showing ways that my character is changing, things that they are coming up against. There should be elements in your story of ways that your character is both succeeding in combating the conflict and where the readers really think that they're not going to succeed. There needs to be some elements of failure. And so that way, no matter what you choose at the end, whether your character ultimately wins or loses, there's evidence for why that happens all the way through. You also really want to make sure that those character actions are consistent. What you don't want to do is have a really abrupt or sudden ending where the main character chooses something or does something that does not fit in what their personality or what their actions would have shown earlier in your story. So if your main character spends the entire story really, really angry, they're not going to just magically be happy at the end. You need to make sure that there is some kind of a series of events or a change in how they feel or somebody else who impacts them in such a way that their change makes sense. Number 3, a satisfying story ending uses elements from the story's beginning and middle. It is not okay to, again, just bring an ending to the end of your story that has nothing to do with where the rest of your story has been going. Even an ironic twist or kind of a surprise or climactic ending, there should have been hints or things that happen earlier in your story that make sense, even if it's a surprise to your readers. So again, you really want to make sure that things are kind of sprinkled all the way throughout. And then lastly, great story endings make the reader feel something. And so you really want to pump up your use of descriptive details, potentially figurative language. You also really want to make sure that you spend time thinking about what you want the end of your story to feel like, so that you know what kinds of words to choose, what kind of descriptions to include, and things of that nature. There are lots of examples of narrative endings, and so I'm going to scroll through these here. You also have this sheet linked in Schoology, and so you're able to go back and take a look at these later if you choose. But there are circular endings where you go back to the beginning of a story and the author can kind of show how the beginning and the end are connected, how things that the character experienced or learned at the beginning tie in. There are surprise endings where it just is that unsuspected twist. There's a lesson or a moral ending where the character may actually talk about something that they have learned. There's kind of that warm, fuzzy ending where you feel just really good inside and everything is just tied up nice and neatly. Again, those are typically, you're going to be heavier on emotions in that kind of an ending. There's a reflection ending where if you are writing in third person, or even if you're writing in first person, the narrator of the story kind of steps back and reflects on what has happened in the story. Sometimes that can be a little bit more advanced of an ending, but it's a possibility. You can have a cliffhanger ending, which leaves the reader kind of hanging on and wanting more. Again, it should at least hint at the end of your conflict, but it may not actually write exactly what happens or finish everything up. There's a question ending where a story ends with a question to keep the reader thinking. It usually involves the reader, and you're trying to make the writing memorable in this kind of a story. But what you want to do is not end with just kind of a blank philosophical question. What you want to do is end with a question that your character would naturally be posing as a result of everything that they've experienced throughout your story. There's funny thoughts or humorous endings where you can end with something that makes the reader laugh. That's usually especially good if you've kind of had a funny story all the way through. Again, you don't really want to have any abrupt changes in your characters. There's an image ending, which is probably one of my favorites. It is the story ends with an important scene that the writer shows the reader, and it's all through vivid details. It's all through description, and it's the idea is you're going to describe this scene to really touch on your reader's emotions, and it definitely conveys a strong mood. You can also really talk about your theme through that description. It's a good way to end. That's also a really good way to integrate culture again at the end of your story. And then there's also a dialogue ending where the story ends with an important conversation or a quote, and you kind of captivate your audience by making the characters more realistic and revealing something else about their personality. The last thing I had to show you are some models of different types of endings to get you started. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a look at each of these models, and I just want you to pause the video as you're going through and looking at each. So this one is an example of how to end with dialogue. This one is an example of how to connect the beginning to the ending. This one is how to end with a description of the setting. And then this is an example of how to kind of go back and reflect on that lesson that's learned. And that one is an example of something that's written in first person. Again, pause the video each time and you can spend a little bit more time looking through each of those models. Now that we're finished, please know that we do expect a really good short story ending. So if you are feeling really caught up in your story, that's great, but you may go ahead and skip to the ending so that you know kind of how to work backwards from where you want your story to end to where you had stopped in your writing. You also just don't forget to make sure that you are sprinkling in your theme all the way throughout your story and that you have all the different elements of culture that we've been talking about from the beginning of this project. Best of luck, and we can't wait to read your stories.